Hey, everybody, welcome to the EVOQ.BIKE podcast. We have a great conversation today centered around men's health and some topics that aren't necessarily chatted about enough. And Alex Balashaw brought this up to me in an email. We were going back and forth, and I said, this would be a great podcast topic. So, Alex, I'm going to shift it to you. Why don't you give quick background, however much you want to share, and then even if you want to touch on the bullet points that you listed out, and we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, hi. I'm Alex Balashaw. I'm a relatively new EVOQ athlete, only as of the last year or so. All of a Cat 4, but yeah, moving along. So this is an interesting topic. It's an interesting topic because it doesn't get a lot of press, of course. I think when we talk about to be here, let's be clear. The theory of the case of why we're here, why we're talking about this is because there's obviously in men's health land certainly in women's health land as well. We're just more equipped to comment on the former here, I suppose. There is a tension between intense endurance sports training and both sex drive and sexual performance. And usually when people talk about the benefits of exercise and sports training, it's all very, very salutary. It's very good. It increases stamina and vitality and makes you perform better. And it's because it's aerobics, or exercise is good for you. All those things are undoubtedly true. But it does come at a certain cost. And yeah, it doesn't get a lot of airtime, for the usual host of reasons. But I think, besides the obvious ones and obvious things like, men's general reluctance to talk about things like this. I think it's also hard to talk about because, unavoidably in doing so, you're probably, in some dimension or another talking about your sex life as well. And even if you say you're not, it's that's like asking for a friend stuff. If you say, well, I've struggled with this or I've struggled with that, you're unavoidably, offering some insight into something that's normally very, very private for people, particularly in the context of go get them sports where everything's always good, where you're supposed to have a very, very cheerful, very optimistic disposition about everything. And then that's, I suppose, one factor. And gosh, I think another one has to be, just the fact that it's a stressful topic in relationships. I think you and I touched on this in our internal discussions, but when we were going back and forth on it, one of the major themes that emerged is that, the ebb and flow of training blocks and athletic training and sex and your sex life and your personal life more generally has a rhythm of planning about it, which, we think of sex as a very, very spontaneous thing. We think of it something that just, you go kind of where the wind takes you. And plus, if you're kind of like me anyway, and you're a type B person and really fairly averse to planning, and, maybe a Training Peaks calendar is like the snow-capped summit of like your executive function in life, then, to pile yet another thing that you have to modulate and think about and structure into it is also hard. So it's all of these different things that make it really worthwhile to explore. And of course, there's a female side to this too. And, I think here you have to differentiate maybe a little bit between the way that sports impacts sex drive versus the way it impacts the ability to deliver on sex drive. I think those are related but somewhat different things.
So that's a very interesting fine line. And so break that down a little bit more, meaning that you actually are hungry for it, or versus, okay, I can do this and make it happen. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And of course they're interrelated, because obviously, if you are really into it, it tends to be the case that you can also are better equipped to make it happen, all other things being equal, but they're not quite the same. Training is objectively fatiguing, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily sexually disinterested. And the rhythms and flows of all that never really get explored as part of talking about it with talking about the ways that we talk about a lot of the ways that biking impacts your life. You've had a few podcasts and video drops where you talked about the impact of cycling and training on relationships and how to manage that balance and work-life balance and issues like that. But we never really talk about sex and training balance. And there is a balance. There are tension. That's why we're here. And I thought it would be good to explore and get your guys' perspective on this, because it's something to which I'm relatively new in terms of trying to kind of wrap my head around it myself. I'm not new to cycling, but I'm on track to ride like 12,000 miles this year, which I think is, probably 2.5 times more than I've ever ridden in a year, maybe twice, So the volume is just crushing compared to what it used to be. And of course, it's been, very good. But once you start getting into this territory, that's very different than riding 3,000 miles a year as a casual rider and talking about how that impacts your sex life.
Which is
no.
So at this point, though, do you still feel good? Because that was something we kind of talked about a few months ago of like, man, you are racking up miles, feeling great. And you're like, yeah, still feel good. I think it's the rest is the key. And we won't get too off topic on this, but yeah, I mean, I think people can surprise themselves how much they can ride as long as they're resting. Most athletes will go 3 months, they might rest a couple days. They don't take that full week where they get that hunger going. And then you're thinking, man, I really want to be riding. I think that's so important during the rest week to miss the bike so that you can, in the end, ride more.
No, I agree with that. Certainly, if you look at as I think you did, if you look at my ride history and power analysis for the prior year, when I also rode a lot of miles, I think it was like 7,600, and I was trying, but it was, just sort of improvised, and there really wasn't much rest there at all.
And way less endurance.
Yes.
More smashing, less aerobic work. So
yeah.
So you brought up a ton of good points, and I think so then we can pass the mic here. I don't know where we want to take this first. The piece that I think is the most interesting is kind of what we had as the bullet point number 4, the hormonal effect of performance, wanting to have sex. That's super important in life. And that's actually a huge marker that I use. Am I training too much? If I don't want to have sex, I'm like, this is not right. But the other points were, I think we can sort of breeze past the inherent fatigue aspect, or, fatigue is going to be decreased libido, but I would put a question mark next to that. It's something that I think you can fatigue yourself and be training, but still want to have sex and be more than, hey, I can make this happen, but want it to happen. The second one was the physiomechanics of riding, people's position on the bike. Are they doing damage to the perineum? We can talk about that. Increased stress, just to what you had said. Exercise is great, but when is there too much? We just talked about number 4. And then I don't know much on number 5. You would put maybe a dehydration warrants a bullet point, but if someone has comments on that, we can talk about that. But I would say, Andy and Patrick, when we passed this conversation across the board to coaches and said, hey, who wants to jump in on this? What sort of jumped out to you that you thought this is an interesting conversation? Like where did your mind go with that topic?
Content, in my exploration of things and just trying to learn what's hot in the world. And this has not come up. I've never seen it, on a related search scroll on YouTube. And so that was number 1. And then I think everybody's got relatable stories. I immediately thought of my first year riding when I was really training in the first winter, and like the fatigue of that first week. And, not only was my libido gone, but I mean, I was just like sleeping all the time. I was so tired because I put myself through more fatigue than I ever had previously in my life. I was like a non-athlete, and all of a sudden, like, I'm going to train, and you do, 2-3 cycles of 3 on, 1 off. Cause that was how we did it. And I was like, it was like December, and I think I just done my first like 12-hour week, and I was just totally tanked. And I felt fine after a week, but I had that memory. And then the other aspect is, I've definitely finished races and like okay, I got to go pee. And it's like, it hurts a little bit to pee. And like, that's not a good thing, but that's a real situation that I immediately related to. So yeah, there's definitely things that you can do to address this stuff. But I related to your desire to kind of talk about this, Alex. So I thought it was cool. So thanks a lot for bringing this up. I don't know, Andy, you want to add anything before we talk about mitigation strategies? Or
Yeah, thank you for opening these topics, because I know it's it's funny. It's my second podcast and I'm already speaking about that. But this is something that was never spoken about, and it should be spoken, because it is an issue, and it affects your relationship, it affects your performance, it affects also your well-being and your self-confidence with your partner and with yourself. Yeah. And the second part is that, people speak about sport that everything is healthy, and some parts of sports are not healthy and should be addressed as it is. And like you said, now when you finish a race and you have to pee and it hurts, that's something that the body tells you that you did something wrong, or you push too much. Yeah. And especially when you think about as a vital organ, especially for confidence and also for it can be hard for the head just to think about it. And if you just neglect the problem, I think it can get really worse. And in the end, I know people that neglected the problem for too long, and now then they had to have surgery because of the perineum issue.
Let's go into that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
I was going to say, let's go into that since you both brought that up. Let's talk about the post-race. So is that from sitting in a funny position or like on the rivet and too much stress on that? Or what have you guys found out about that?
Yeah, for me, that on the rivet for like the entire race feeling, and not maybe having a saddle that could be as optimized as it could have been. I haven't had those issues, knock on wood, in a long time. I've changed a lot of aspects of my setup and my equipment, so it's hard to kind of pinpoint one exact thing. But saddle choice saddle choice and fit have to be the number one way that you address that sort of thing. And if there is a problem, like just simply even having the awareness to go, that's a problem. Like, don't just ignore it. Do something about it, or do some research or try a different saddle. Like, I think that's key. Whereas people maybe have this built-in mentality to just suck it up, it'll get better. It's like, I'm not strong enough yet.
Yeah, I think you have to have a little perspective on what feels right and what feels wrong. I mean, biomechanically, we were not designed to ride bikes. Much of our equipment is really designed to mitigate that point in some fashion or another. And without having gone through a lot of saddles and a lot of options, you may not necessarily know. Before I got a fit, I used to think that certain aspects of being on the bike were just inherently uncomfortable because that's just part of it. Suck it up. Plus, when you're young and you're made out of rubber, it doesn't really matter that much. Then it starts to show itself more as you become a little more fragile. The other thing is, it's fit and saddle choice are one thing, but you can still use your saddle wrong, like I do. I end up sitting on the rivet a lot, just sliding forward on the saddle. It doesn't matter if the saddle from a formal perspective I use a very, very good fitter. I have very good confidence in all of his conclusions and judgments about my various limitations and dimensions and so forth, and his saddle choices. And you can still sit on the saddle badly, and you just have to learn to sit on the saddle goodly. And that takes time. But it can be a real issue. I mean, you're interrupting blood flow in the perineum. That has impacts on the rest of your life in many facets. If you do it on a chronic basis, I still have to remind myself, if I get out of the saddle and then sit back down, I need to make sure I sit back down in the right way, back on my sit bones, because half the time I don't. And then it takes me a while to realize it. I'm getting better at it, but it's definitely a thing.
I've definitely found that with I switched saddles recently, and I think not so much from a men's health, but it's actually a topic that I've been thinking of because there would be days where I felt like I had to pee, or I would pee, and it wasn't like I really had to go, but when I was riding, I'm thinking, man, I gotta go. And I was noticing that I was sliding forward more, just as we're talking about. And so I've switched this SMP, which definitely keeps me back a little bit more. I think there could be something else at play, which Alex and I have talked about, these prostate CBD capsules from Hello Blue. After he started talking about some things, I started trying them. And unfortunately, my dad had actually just reached out to me. This could be a whole other wrench in the story. He told me that I have to get a PSA test because I guess this prostate cancer is hereditary, and it skipped him, but they found it in my cousin because he took this test. Like, so now you got to go get tested. So now I'm actually a little paranoid that something could be going on. So when I get back from Ecuador, that's first on the list of getting a PSA test. But yeah, I think the message that I want to send there is I had been on the same saddle for 11 years, 135,000 miles, and finally just was thinking, this isn't the saddle for me anymore. It was allowing me to slide forward too much. And there were other things I think too, that as I've been getting older, I think my cadence has naturally slowly been lowering. And so I'd kind of get in a different position with that. And it's just one little thing changes the next thing. And I always try to remember when I went from 175 cranks to 177.5, the smallest change, and it felt like a totally different bike. So when something feels weird, just like Patrick said, don't ignore it, address it. Think of any little thing. You're leaning a little bit farther forward. You're leaning back more. You're whatever. The saddle's worn out. It's, there's so many things that can affect you on the bike. So don't ignore it, but start trying to address it.
Yeah, I think another part of this that, sort of just bleeds over into how cycling as a lifestyle affects your personal life, of course, that we talked about a lot, is just the fact that as you go through a hard training block or the ebb and flow of hard workouts through the week or whatever, I'm not going to say you have to plan your sex life around that. It's not a binary 0 or 1 kind of thing where like, well, on these days I can do it, and on those days I can't. It's not that clear cut. But you have to sort of take into account the global, the more macro perspective on your fatigue and stuff like that, of course. And it's bad enough that partners already hate the scheduling that goes into endurance sports in general, because it's like, well, I can't, sorry, honey, I can't stay out late on Friday night because I got an early morning, in Saturday endurance crusher or whatever, and all those kinds of issues. And you might say, well, why are you calling it a crusher if it's endurance? But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's bad enough, but like, what are you gonna? What's
but that's
next?
real. That's real.
It's real. But like, what are you gonna do?
What do you do?
Gonna put? But beyond that, well, what do? You put sex on Training Peaks, give it like 25 TSS. What am I gonna do with the other hour and 58 minutes? So that level of micromanagement is ride endurance rest of the time.
Oh my God.
Well, but you get my point. Like that level of micromanagement in your regime, when you're already beholden to scheduling certain aspects of your personal life around all this, can be a really added stressor. And like Alex said, I think, or like Andy said, I think it really can affect your self-confidence and even your kind of sense of dignity as a person to a point.
What's your thought on that, Andy? Someone who's done big volume, who's been on the pro, you're gone, you're racing a ton, you come home, maybe you're training a lot. Like, how do you manage that when there's someone else there that needs love, physically, mentally, everything, and you're coming back, maybe you're exhausted? What's the strategy?
First, I want to touch the saddle issue, because we cannot pick our saddles every time. Like we have sponsored saddles, so we have to work around that. which sometimes can be an issue because you get a saddle that doesn't fit. Okay, maybe you can pick in the range of the saddle, but it doesn't really matter. Sometimes you just find a saddle that's horrible for you, and then you have to work around that to make it better. And that can affect you. So, and one thing we forget with the saddle is that saddles, at least a lot of them, especially if you're not made from carbon, they get worn out or bent pretty soon. And the saddle doesn't always get bent like evenly. So it can get, because you also don't sit on the saddle evenly. So then it gets bent in one side, and that can make things a lot worse really, really fast. Second is that a lot of people have problems because of the riding position, especially in a TT. When you sit really low and on the front, and you're always pushing. And third part is that we forget. We always speak about you sitting on the rivet, but we forget about stretching. When you do a big block of training and you are fatigued, your muscles get shorter. Yeah. So naturally, on the first, let's say on the third day, especially in the race, you can feel it that you're all not cramped up, but you are fatigued. Your muscles are fatigued, and if you don't do a lot of stretching, or at least some part of it, you feel that it sits differently on the saddle. And with that, you also start to move way more forward on the saddle because muscles are shorter.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So answer the tougher question. How do you deal with the relationship side of things when you're going through a big training block and it's like, yo, baby, we're going out to party tonight. And you're like, oh man, I just did this 23-hour week.
We have 4 kids, so I think
I was actually wondering if that was going to be you're like that doesn't happen. So that's good.
This is my part.
So you need to have, okay, so you need to step into the plate 4 times, make some babies, and then your pass is set.
Yeah.
It affects you. Yeah. So especially in the first 2 days, for me, that I think if you finish the race on Sunday, the Tuesday is the hardest, and you have to work around that. They also need love. Also now with the kids, they also need love. And sometimes it's really hard. Yeah, it's because it's not only physical stress. I think physical stress I can get around, but it's more mental because from the race perspective, mentally is sometimes harder. And it affects you. It affects also your relationships. Because everything that affects you as a person will also affect your partner and the people around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I kind of wonder which parts of this are really cycling specific though, because anybody that, works hard for a living or does extensive physical work or has a stressful job or long hours be like, yeah, exerting yourself impacts your sex life. Who knew? But when you start talking about at least, sports per se, there's an added dimension to it when you're sort of philosophizing about it with your partner too, because working 16 hours a day in the ER or at the package sorting facility or whatever are sort of not optional. You just have to. This is something we do fundamentally for recreation at the end of the day. Or maybe the objectives we would characterize them as something a little bit more cosmological than recreation. But at any rate, it's seen to be discretionary by the outside world. There's no argument about that. Unless you are literally a pro athlete who's literally being paid a lot of money just to ride your bike. And that's a very infinitesimally, vanishingly small percentage of even people we consider pro athletes or pro level. So, having to defend the giant hole that it blows in the rest of your life and advocate for it constantly and apologize for it when this is at the end of the day a somewhat a very life optional set of commitments. For you guys maybe less so. You guys have in some dimension or another made careers around cycling, maybe not necessarily on a full-time basis, but like for someone like me, for example, who has a day job and a whole other set of responsibilities, and cycling, like for many of the athletes you coach, is just something you do on the side. It can be a little hard, because then it's like, well, I'm just not feeling into it last few days. I'm sorry. I'm just really tired. I'm barely even getting my work done. Oh, whose fault is that?
I don't know if most cyclists are so passionate that even if they aren't training 20 hours and they're riding 10 hours, I don't think most don't look at it as on the side. They're so passionate about, like, this sport brings in, you know what I mean? You do it on the side, but you talk about
I don't look at it. Of course, I don't. Yes, I look at it as a primary quality of my existence as well. But in terms of how it looks from the side, objectively, it's like, well, that's not what pays the bills. So
I mean,
go ahead.
I really admire our clients, because doing this, especially when you're wrecking such big miles that like Alex is doing, and there's not only micro and macro management, and you have to keep everyone happy. You have to keep your partner happy, and you have to keep yourself happy. And on the other hand, if you want to train like Alex is doing it with a full-time job, and you cannot do it because some you have a lot of work and it's interrupting you, and you have a lot of stress because you just want to train, and that also affects you. People don't realize the stress that comes with the normal job, how much it affects cycling and also sex life. Yeah, because putting all these things together, it's tougher than we actually think. At least us.
Yeah, the dichotomy between these two headspaces is a source of stress in itself, and can also alter your mood, and like many other psychological complications, of course, has a lot of bearing on the relationship side of it. Yeah, definitely.
I think one tactic is, especially actually since getting married, I do less long 5 and 6 hour rides, because it's just not the best look to come home and sit on the couch and look like a puddle for 2 hours afterwards. It's like, okay, well, maybe if I do 4 hours and I actually have energy to do other things, that's just where I'm going to be at right now. And finding that balance. I mean, it's when it's no longer just you. If you're 22 and just rolling solo, like, go buck wild, but things definitely change. And I think there's still a way to get the training dose that you want in. You just have to be more creative with it. So now I'll do more 4 hour rides or 3 hour rides. I rarely ride 2 hours. And also the aspect of, there's something about being gone 5 hours. It is a pretty solid amount. Leave at 8, you're back at 1. 8, you really start getting ready at 7:15. You get back at 1. You're not done showered till 2. Like, this is a kind of an all day affair. Whereas 4 hours, it's just you're not gone as long, and it doesn't seem as much of the whole day is based around the bike. That's the biggest thing in my relationship is Chris will say, can we not base this weekend around the bike? So we'll have a husband's day where if I get to ride, I ride, but we're definitely not talking about, okay, so what are we doing tomorrow morning? Because I think I'm going to ride at 10 and the weather might do this, but if it does that, I might do this instead. And it's like, we're just going to do our thing. If the ride happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I've learned to enjoy that day. I mean, it's some days you don't get to ride, but back to what I was saying to Alex about being able to ride 12,000 miles, damn, I'm definitely hungry the next day. And it just keeps that fire going, which I think is really good for long-term.
Yeah, but also your characterization of this situation, speaks to your fitness and where you are in cycling. But, it's important to remember that for, the Cat 4s among us, a somewhat brutal 2 hour ride can leave you sitting in a puddle for 2 hours too, depending on just what it is, which sounds silly if you're where you're at. But all I mean to say by that is that even much smaller training commitments can still have that all day aspect. And I mean, let's face it, some of us are just very inefficient people. I'm one of them. Like, you're talking about getting ready at 7:15 and, coming back at 1 and not being out of the shower till 2. For me, all that can grow to easily like swallow up a whole day. Just by the time you get around to like lumbering over from the shower and getting your snack and just thinking about things, and then just kind of zoning out like a zombie for a while. And then, of course, it depends on what kind of work you do too. Not to belabor this point, but when you're those of us who do kind of very focus and intensive tasks, I liken it to writing. If you've ever written a dissertation or a book, you know how this goes. Like if you've been away for it for a week and you come back to it, you just sit there and play with the little scroll bar in Word for 4 hours and stare at the screen and do nothing. And that's if you got all the focus and energy in the world. And it's because you've got this massive universe of context that you've got to keep in your head. If you're writing a 176-page book and it's a work in progress, then you really have to be completely zoned into the flow and the arc of the overall narrative and where things are going in your text and the flow of ideas. And in my case, it's software work. It's very much like that. So you come back from a 2-hour endurance ride in the middle of the day. By the time you get around to sitting back and like trying to focus into something that you last briefly looked at 8 a.m. this morning, it's very possible that just like nothing is going to get done the rest of the day. That's just
I would disagree in that one. You just got to figure it out. I mean,
no, you do. And I mean, as evidenced by my ability to make a living, nevertheless, I to some extent have, but it's a struggle is my point.
Yeah.
And it bears upon this discussion too, because it affects other aspects of your life too. I think even if your relationship isn't necessarily intellectual or creative knowledge work in terms of the demands it places on your brain, it has some of the facilities required to be adequately engaged with it work the same way. Sometimes you're just tired. And it's not even necessarily a physical tiredness, to Andy's point. You're just kind of mentally spacey. That kind of long COVID brain fog that you get after a long ride is something that affects certainly affects my interactions with other people. It can.
So if basically, thanks. I think we've all kind of acknowledged that there is no denying that there is a physical fatigue that will kind of infect other aspects of our life if we're not coming up with the right mitigation strategies for that. Like it's just undeniable. Cycling makes you tired. Anything that makes you tired is going to make you less focused on what you were doing before you were doing it, being it riding a bike or whatever else it may be that's not related to the other tasks that are required, life tasks with work or relationships. And there's this physical fatigue, and like Andy mentioned, there's the emotional and just the like of a racing where you're just exhausted from the stress of a race week, and that's all going to kind of have an impact. But is the impact on a scale of like, wow, that was super easy, it was a recovery ride, to like, this is 0 to 100, 100 being like, this is the absolutely not healthy side of the sport, where we just sometimes go way past what is maintainable even within a broad spectrum or on the micro scale. And I think having an awareness, having experience, everything that we've all done through the years to gain better awareness of ourselves, we have to make sure we don't go from 0 to 100. We have got to find a way to get to pull things back once you get to about 50, right? And then, so instead of getting past the point of no return, you're getting back to somewhat of an equilibrium. That happens in rest weeks, that happens with diet, that happens with paying attention to sleep. Alex, you kind of categorize yourself as a type B personality, creative, scattered a little bit, kind of drawing connections all the time. I definitely put myself in that same camp. I don't like thrive on a schedule. I thrive on, just, drawing conclusions and being creative and that sort of thing. And it doesn't necessarily, those two things don't lend themselves well to each other all the time. Right brain, left brain, they have to work in harmony, but, one is going to take control eventually. But for me, being in that same kind of personality trait, I just had to adapt. I had to become a little bit different. And when I'm doing it well, I'm just I'm taking steps to make sure that I know, ahead of time what a day is going to look like and how that's going to affect tomorrow and how that's going to affect next week. And by kind of getting that sort of game plan laid out for myself, not after a ride, but before a ride or rides, I do a lot better. Just jotting down notes helps a lot. And then, in terms of, you got to get the right amount of sleep. You need to eat the right foods. The more you perfect your ability to train by the things you're doing off the bike, the less of an impact the bike will have on your global life. And that's just that's a learned skill for sure.
I was actually going to ask you a specific question, but you brought up another question. What are the foods that you talk about that you think are helpful? Just meaning eating clean? And if so, what would that mean for somebody that might not really know what that means? If you were telling me 12 years ago, eat cleaner, I'd be like, I don't know, huh? Like less chicken wings or no chicken wings? What do you mean when you mean the foods?
Yeah, I mean, pretty basics here, but you got to, if you're riding and training a lot, you need to refuel for that. I mean, my kind of gold standard is the less things I can eat out of a package, the better I end up feeling. Luckily for me, my wife's a great cook. I like to cook and I'm pretty basic. I don't mind eating rice and beans and bread like all the time. The basic stuff that's going to keep the energy levels high, pre and post riding. I was carb low for a really long time. And I can't say with certainty that had a huge impact in fatigue in earlier years, but I'm pretty sure it did. And getting behind on nutrition is going to be an issue. But, incorporating whole foods, eating fish, eating red meat occasionally, but not all the time, all the basic stuff that adds up. Take a multivitamin, do your post-ride, shake that, with the athletic greens and the collagen, whatever it is, whatever it's going to take, so that like, okay, I'm going to do this. And by doing those things, the next day you're going to be less trash than if you ate just the candy or just the bag of chips.
So the thing that you did not bring up yet, which I can't believe, what is one thing that an athlete could do to have a better hormonal benefit? This is like the wall. Yeah, Balashov. What is it?
Pump the iron.
Yes. I was like waiting. When Alex was talking, I was like,
best.
I'm going to ask Patrick this question. That's going to be dead on. So
it was a leading question.
That was the number one. Lifting. I cannot. And I actually just ran into an athlete that just started lifting, Cat 1. And he's already seen, in a few weeks, you start to see different body definition. I said, have you had sex after lifting yet? He said, no. Why? I said, go do it. I mean, I think sex after lifting is awesome. And that is when we talk about planning. I know if I'm like crushing some weights, and I don't even really crush weights anymore, I'm lifting more by RP and never really maxing out. There's more like, oh man, I really want to do this. This is awesome. And it's that difference between I want to do it versus I know I should want to do it, so I'm going to do it. I don't like that feeling. And I had that feeling of, I feel like sex should be going on right now. And last year when I trained too much, that was definitely more the mind state. And when I caught myself thinking that, I was like, whoa, okay, wait, I need to dial this back a little bit. But if you don't, it's easy to not see that. And, it's easy to be, as we always say, it's, you're the athlete in the trees doing all the workouts. It's kind of hard to zoom out on yourself and see the big picture. And it's really crucial, especially when it comes to being in a relationship and making the other person happy and feel loved. And that's definitely physically and emotionally.
Yeah, you brought up something interesting. I'm going through my mid-late 30s now, and there's a general background of slowly falling testosterone, obviously, and I was aware of that before I got into formal training. And you realize you're not 23 anymore at some point in terms of how you relate to your sex drive or sex life. And then, of course, training has an additional impact on that. So being able to have the perspective and some amount of formal knowledge, I guess, to separate the two and disentangle them and understand what's fatigue from training and what's just an inevitable part of not being 23 anymore can be a little hard.
Mm-hmm. I think it's more the training, but, and see, this is one of those things that everybody wants everything to be measured. What's my after all these metrics, everything that counts can't be counted. And hormones are one thing that in 20 years, we're going to look back and be like, wow, whoa, we did not even see this happening. If you have some like sex that you really want to have versus the sex that you have to have now, in a weird analogous comparison, those days when you are fresh and you are crushing some hard efforts, you are digging, you are scraping the bottom of the barrel, and you are like, yeah. The days when you don't have the energy to do it and you try, the watts suck, you suck, you're way slower than normal. And that to me is very analogous. That's why I try to lift all year round. We cannot see what's going on hormonally and in our cells, but there is a very vast difference between when the hormones are balanced and how they should be, you are hungry for certain things in life. And that will be a very big plus on the bike. When it's not, and you're got the malaise and you can do your FTP workout, whatever, when things get crazy in a bike race, that's the race I think that you just don't have it sometimes. You're just not this animal and you're tired. So yeah, I'm excited when there is a cellular meter that we can see way more of what's going on, or like where at some point in life we're going to eat it and there's going to be a thing that's like, oh, you just got this many kilojoules of energy and it was this and this, and like the next thing you should eat is this, and it's just going to be super optimized and ridiculous and whatever. But yeah, we're so dumb compared to where we're going to be going, obviously, evolution.
Yeah. But I mean, zooming out a little bit from like the transhumanism and the measurement of everything aspect, in the meantime, there's still an intuitive feel you get over time about, am I just tired from training, or am I just getting older? And for me, that's a process that I struggle with.
That's what I'm saying. I think it's tired because I think, dude, like people that are healthy, they are knocking it out when they're 50, 60, set. Like you definitely should not be now for you. So maybe, on the sidebar, it was like, hey, maybe that 12,000 miles is too much.
Yeah, no, it's not really that. It's just figuring out which feeling is coming from where. And like everything else, it ebbs and flows. It's not a consistent trend this way or that way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're trying to reason about it, I mean, at the beginning of the talk, we talked about kind of a local awareness of local fatigue versus wanting it in the macro. And I think that's where that fits in.
Mm.
So I guess what I'm really trying to say there is when you're still calibrating your instincts for how training affects you, which in my case is very relevant because this is the first year I've actually done formal training per se, or anywhere near this volume. It takes time to build an awareness of how training is affecting you versus, is there something wrong with me versus, am I getting older?
Mm.
And untangling those strands is not necessarily easy. And I guess what I would say to others in my position is, based on my experience, don't reach for really pessimistic conclusions really quickly. Because when I first started riding hard and riding a lot, and this was probably before you and I started doing training, but when I first started riding a lot more than I've ever ridden, it really did hit me like a ton of bricks, and it did affect my personal life in a noticeable way. Not in an injurious way, but it made a difference. Obviously, I was just very fatigued, and it I don't know. It kind of depressed me for a while. It took me a while to reason my way out of that, get a little perspective, add a little bit of rest into the mix, experiment with different ways to ebb and flow the fatigue, and realize that no, it's really not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we speak about hormones, the most hormones we speak about is testosterone, but we forget there's a bunch of other hormones. They also affect our life, yeah. And when we speak about even hormones in food, or affect what's going on, and let's say stress hormone affects our sex health, So cortisol is really, we in the past we measured it quite a lot because it shows the fatigue that's on the body. And there are some things, that you can do about it. And one thing is lifting or doing stuff like that. What also helps me is doing short bursts, just at the finish, at the end of the session. Let's say on a bike ride, that you do a really short burst, like maybe 3, 4, 5 seconds.
Full gas.
Actually, full gas, 5 second sprint, maybe 5 times, 6 times. In the end, let's say I do a zone 3, let's say a tempo ride, tempo climb, and then in the downhill 5, 6 times, short burst, and I could feel the effect of being more vital. I think it's something together with the lifting. It has the same effect, This and it affects and also what some, let's say, stress. We speak also about hormones of happiness. So if you kick a lot, it also affects you, and if you're more happier, it also affects something, So everything is related. And we speak only about cycling now and about endurance sport, which it affects you. But there's all, we forget about the big picture. So it's not only about endurance, but you can do things that you will fix your hormone values.
Vitality was a really good word. Was the word I was looking for earlier. Well said.
I mean, in the end, everything is connected. And we are always chasing, especially when you are you did your basics, you did your and now you're trying to just catch the last things that will affect your performance. And you have to think with a broad eyes, and it's hard sometimes because you are so caught up in your training and so caught up in everything else that you forget to step a little bit back and see what everything else what can affect you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that Brendan brought up at the beginning too, that cycling tends to be a more all-consuming thing for people, even at the amateur level. There are, of course, other challenging sports and endurance disciplines and so forth where people are committing almost all of their time and energy to it, but tends to be closer to like the pro level. Not for everything uniformly, of course, but cycling really is very all-consuming, even at relatively low levels of the totem pole. So this becomes a little bit more relevant. And I think part of it is just because it's a fairly time greedy hobby. I mean, there's really no such thing as an athletically useful half-hour bike ride, right? So you got to put in the volume. It's very well. No, I mean, I suppose one could devise such a ride, yes, but in principle, this is a high volume, high time commitment type of sport, like endurance in general is. But whereas I used to run like many people, never particularly good at it, but a 45-minute run as a daily workout is not really out of question. I think that a lot of runners do that. 45-minute bike ride,
very different.
Very different. So it's got to gobble up a lot of your time and a lot of your energy and a lot of your ability to just sustain something, and that's got to have something to do with the fatigue factor and the way it affects the macroscopy of your mood. You're
burning way more calories. Yeah, for sure. With a few more minutes that we've got here, what last topics do either of you think maybe we missed or want to hit on?
What I want to speak about is this is when you train a lot, and it's not for everybody, and doesn't it's not the same, but some people like the count of spermia in I don't know, how would I say, in a ejaculation. Is that correctly? It's so low that it actually sometimes it's lower than a cancer patient.
Oh, if you're training too much?
Yeah.
Are you talking about the amount or?
Yeah. So let's say if they measure, I don't know how they measure it, but if they measure it when you're overtrained, and your hormone values are bad, so the count of spermia is much lower. So it's
Okay.
actually, yeah, so it's actually much harder if you want to have a baby.
Right.
Much harder to make a baby. You're actually not sterile, but sometimes there were some studies. I think I saw one that you can see that it actually affects a lot. Yeah, and also when you look at the pro cyclists when they have babies, so this is actually really funny. I have three of my kids are born in July. So if you reverse it for 10 months, it's October.
That's when you're home.
Yeah. So that's the start of the off season. Yeah. This is the first time you were without a bike for, let's say, 10 or 14 days. Your testosterone is rocking through the roof, So it's actually, and my first kid was made when we were both sick for 14 days and stuck at home. So,
Wow.
Yeah, it's a funny story, but it's true. And, this is how sometimes endurance sports affect a human or
Yeah.
a man.
So there's a broadly established inverse relationship between endurance sports fatigue and training and testosterone levels, and I suppose the suggested mitigation is lifting and other types of strength exercises, as well as watching your global holistic wellness, if you like. But is there anything else that comes to mind that is something applied that you can work on to help keep this in balance?
Well, what Andy just said, 14 days off the bike, testosterone is rocking after the season. What do? Rest it. That is the number one thing, is getting ahead of your fatigue and never letting it take control. Like getting to that 50% mark. That's why it's 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And at the end of the season, you'll maybe never get exactly to baseline, but that's just not overtraining. That's probably the number one thing for me.
Mm-hmm. That's the number people. So I will get athletes that will say to me, wow, when you make me go hard, I've never gone so hard, but damn, you make me rest a lot, because the week is very resty. And even on Strava, I'll get comments, dude, do you ever rest? I'm like, well, yeah, you just don't see those because I don't get on the bike. I don't do recovery rides. I'm fully off the bike. I sleep a lot. And so people only see 4-hour ride, 4-hour ride, 4-hour ride. They're not seeing walk. Sometimes I post hikes if I do that, but now that I'm in Florida, I don't really do that as often, or just busy with work. And I might ride a couple times during the week, but it's like I was right when you started saying that, Patrick. I'm like, that is get to the 50 that you're talking about. Don't get to 0. And so I think that's super well said. And my point would be lift weights and then recover, and don't lift weights on rest days. You're not resting. People really start screwing everything up. So don't drive yourself into the ground too much.
I think that people try to, sometimes, they want to push just a little bit more, and when you try to push just a little bit more, then you actually go into minus and not into plus. Yeah, it's not every time. If you're pushing a little bit more, people, especially on TV, they say, yeah, you have to work hard and harder and harder and harder. Yeah, but when does it stop? Yeah, and if you don't stop, and if you don't listen to your body, and if you don't rest when it's time to rest, then something will, you will fall off the cliff, and it will take you a month. It will take you a month, not just, let's say, 2 days. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to comprehend the ebb and flow of your own fatigue in relation to where you are in the sport. The 3 weeks on for 1 week off thing, maybe is a kind of a widely practiced standard, but it may not work for you. I know I've had weeks where I should have just taken a rest week in the middle of the block and should have just said to Brendan, like, I'm sorry, man, like this is just not working for me this week. And I don't tend to do that because that's not the schedule, but maybe I should.
Totally. This guy, I've said it from day one. The training.
I know you've said
not
it.
The Bible. I think.
Yeah, no, I know you've said it. I just didn't listen.
It's one thing that I always look at someone when they start to say, kind of tired on Thursday, and on Saturday a little tired. Say, okay, hey, why don't we not go into this third week, and why don't you take a rest week or take 3 days and get rested, and then guess what? We could start a training cycle on a Wednesday. It doesn't have to be Monday. It's arbitrary. It tends to work in these 21-day rotations. It's for the ease of athletes. Most people have more time on the weekends than during the week, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I mean, it always throws someone when there's a rest day on Saturday and they message me, why does it say rest on Saturday? It's like, well, you ride a ton all the time. Can you go do other things today? Oh, I'd love to. It just seems like a mistake. No, this is why. So guys, this is good. I think it opens conversation for people that are still listening. Definitely post questions or comments below or send us a message. Let us know what's worked for you, what hasn't worked, where have you taken missteps so we could maybe make a mini podcast to highlight those. We don't have to dox you and put your name in it, but other things that you've learned on your journey in trying to manage endurance sports fatigue, sex drive, and holistic wellness. And anybody with anything final goodbyes, and Alex, thank you again for bringing this topic to light. I think it's conversation one of many. All right, guys, thanks for doing this, and we'll talk to y'all soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
See you,
Ciao.